Section 1. The Madness of First Contact. Word count / 720. Theme: Misunderstood beginnings, when humanity's willpower defied alien logic. The stars had always beckoned humanity with promise and peril, myth and mathematics. For centuries, people wondered if they were alone. Some dreamed of benevolent neighbors, others feared invasion. But when the stars finally spoke back, it wasn't through booming warships or miraculous technology. It was diplomacy. Polished, peaceful, and far more alien than humanity could have imagined. The Galactic Accord arrived not with weapons, but with emissaries. Their ships, impossibly sleek and gravity-defying, materialized across Earth's orbit like silver petals unfolding in silence. The world stopped. News feeds, militaries, and governments froze as the message came, not in code or static, but in perfect, translated English, Chinese, Urdu, Spanish, Swahili, and more. We are the Accord. You are now known to us. We extend peace, knowledge, and welcome. Do not fear. Let us begin. For a moment, Earth collectively held its breath. The shock passed, followed by awe, and then by suspicion. Because something didn't feel right. The Accord's representatives, tall, androgynous, biologically optimized beings with serene expressions and shimmering skin, descended to Earth in diplomatic dropships. They carried no weapons, only knowledge. 1,000 years of galactic peace, they said. A countless member species. The end of war. Of disease. Of suffering. All humanity had to do was join. But that was where the dissonance began. Humanity didn't know how to process peace without cost. Suffering had shaped them. Every corner of their history, every continent, every century, was marred by blood, struggle, revolt, invention, rebirth. Every advancement had come through pain. Empires rose and fell on stubbornness, not serenity. So when the Accord said, "Shed your weapons, your chaos, your irrationality," it struck a nerve humanity didn't know it still had. The United Nations, reformed and strengthened in the decades before First Contact, convened a global summit with the Accord delegates. The meeting was held in Geneva, though holographic relays projected it across the world. Humanity watched eagerly, nervously. What they saw confused them even more. The Accord spoke in harmonious unity, no disagreement, no visible emotion. They valued efficiency above all. They viewed conflict not as a challenge to be overcome, but a flaw to be eliminated. They shared medical technologies, atmospheric stabilizers, energy systems that could power entire cities without pollution. They were, by every measure, a utopia of the stars. And yet, something was missing. They didn't feel. Not like humans did. Their laughter was rehearsed. Their empathy was statistical. And their interest in Earth's culture seemed superficial, amused by the concept of competitive sports, baffled by poetry, and unsettled by music that expressed pain or passion. But the moment that defined it all came on day 9 of the summit. An Accord representative, Vale T, a high arbiter, offered a proposal that all Earth nations dismantle their militaries within 10 solar cycles to comply with Accord peace protocols. The chamber fell silent. The president of a major power, flanked by military leaders and advisors, responded simply, "No." Vale T tilted their head. "You do not require defense. In Accord space, there is no war." Another leader stood. "And what if something comes from beyond Accord space? Or what if you change your mind? We've earned our scars. We won't give up the right to defend ourselves." The Accord delegates exchanged silent signals. Vale T returned, voice calm but cooler. "This insistence is indicative of unstable psychological profiles. You cling to violence." A general rose then, an old soldier with lines of war across his face. "We don't cling to violence. We remember why we fight. You call it irrational. We call it spirit." From that moment forward, the divide widened. The Accord classified humanity as a category: 3 reactive species, volatile, unpredictable, and unfit for full integration. Observation was deemed necessary. Subtle pressure was applied through trade restrictions, exclusion from galactic forums, and soft containment policies. But humanity, once overlooked, became stubborn. Instead of complying, they questioned. Instead of fearing, they studied. Instead of bending, they grew stronger. New technologies were adapted from Accord blueprints. Entire nations began pouring resources into space expansion, building vessels not just for exploration, but for sovereignty. To the Accord, it was madness, a primitive species rejecting paradise. But to humanity, it was something else entirely. It was their right to struggle, to earn their place, not be handed it, to rise not through compliance, but through conviction. Earth scientists started pushing boundaries. Engineers broke old rules. Artists created works that defied the Accord's sterile aesthetics. Children were raised with stories not of peace bought by surrender, but of courage earned in resistance. A popular broadcast emerged, going viral across Earth and slipping into galactic networks via pirate relays. It was a simple message spoken by a young girl. You say we're mad, but we've faced extinction, genocide, fire, and ice, and we're still here. Maybe that's not madness. Maybe that's our spirit. And it burns brighter than your stars. The Accord labeled it propaganda. The people of Earth called it truth. And so began the era of uneasy watchfulness. When Earth stood alone under a web of surveillance and sanctions, its people branded dangerous and unstable. But in backrooms, laboratories, and underground bunkers, humanity whispered to itself a promise. If they fear our spirit, let them. We'll show them what it means to burn. Because they had called it madness. But humanity knew better. It was their spirit, and it was only just awakening. Section 2. Trial by Fire, the Test of War. Word count / 720. Theme. Humanity's resilience forged in conflict, the moment the galaxy saw the unthinkable. The first attack came not from the Accord itself, but from within its ranks. The Varn had once been the most feared warlords in the Orion Arm, a reptilian, four-armed species forged in molten deserts and acid seas. They had conquered 23 systems before the Accord defeated and pacified them a millennium ago. Stripped of military might, the Varn had become little more than reluctant members of a peace they had never truly accepted. To them, the arrival of humanity wasn't a curiosity, it was a warning. The Accord had neutered the Varn, but humanity was rising, raw and untamed. The humans reminded the Varn of themselves, only more chaotic, more stubborn, and more alive. And so, the Varn made a choice. They launched a preemptive strike against Earth, not sanctioned by the Accord, but tolerated by some of its more rigid species who secretly hoped it would solve the human problem. They called it a containment action. Humanity called it genocide. The first wave hit New Delhi, Sao Paulo, and Lagos simultaneously. Orbital kinetic strikes turned skyscrapers into molten craters. Biological agents seeded the atmosphere, targeting urban centers. Automated drones swept across oceans and continents, hunting warm bodies with terrifying precision. Earth was not prepared. Millions died in the first week. Communications fell apart. Infrastructure crumbled. The world, united in distrust of the Accord, had never imagined that it would need to unify again in the name of sheer survival. But humanity did not break. Something ancient woke in them, a fire stoked by centuries of struggle. Their greatest strength had never been their technology or numbers. It was their refusal to stay dead. Nations fell into line not under threats or treaties, but through necessity. Russia, China, the United States, and India merged their military commands overnight. The European Union and African Federation redirected every satellite to a joint defense grid. Latin American nations provided critical launch infrastructure. The private space industry repurposed mining vessels into battlecruisers. In 19 days, the United Earth Defense Pact was born. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't perfect. But it was human. Humanity adapted faster than the Accord believed possible. Every Varn drone that was captured was reverse-engineered. Within a month, prototype railguns and plasma torpedoes rolled out of repurposed automobile factories. Fusion reactors were pulled out of theoretical labs and shoved into spacecraft under fire. What stunned the galaxy wasn't that Earth was fighting back. It was how they fought. Human pilots willingly overloaded their reactors to ram enemy ships in suicide runs. Squads of Marines held off invaders on crumbling continents, surrounded and outnumbered 100-1. Civilians took up arms, coordinated with resistance networks through makeshift mesh nets and ham radios, using centuries-old guerrilla tactics alongside bleeding-edge tech. On the colony world of Luna 5, a team of cybernetic engineers hacked a captured Varn frigate, installed a human-AI hybrid pilot named Yara, and sent it alone into deep space. It jumped behind enemy lines, disabling a Varn fleet by causing a cascading overload in their power relays, then self-destructed in the heart of their flagship. Her last broadcast, recorded across half a dozen frequencies. They thought we'd die quietly. They don't know what we are. They don't know what we can be. The Battle of Ceres Station became a legend across the stars. A small human fleet, outnumbered 30-1, held the asteroid's stronghold for 5 days. They used mining lasers, gravity slingshots, and even asteroid fragments themselves as kinetic weapons. When reinforcements finally arrived, every surviving ship was either damaged or jury-rigged, but flying. The Accord watched in horror. This wasn't a war. This was a reaction. The Varn expected surrender. What they got was escalation. What frightened the Accord most wasn't that humanity fought. It was that they enjoyed the fight, not out of bloodlust, but from the fire of meaning, of protecting something that mattered. And slowly, that fire spread. Alien civilizations began to watch humanity not with fear, but with wonder. Species long subdued under the Accord's emotionless peace saw something in the humans that echoed a longing buried deep within themselves. The right to choose, to rise, to struggle, to matter. Some Accord citizens began leaking information. Some rebel scientists began smuggling human tech. A few even defected, choosing to fight alongside the species once deemed irrational. On Earth, a phrase became a mantra, painted on the hulls of ships and shouted before battle. They called it madness. We made it our banner. By the time the Varn were driven back, Earth was forever changed. Entire cities had been lost. Billions were gone. But humanity stood taller than ever, scarred, yes, but unbroken. What began as an extermination had become a crucible. The galaxy had expected humanity to crumble under the weight of the stars. Instead, they lit a fire among them. And this was only the beginning. Section 3. The Spirit That Could Not Break. Word count / 730. Theme. The war becomes ideological, spirit as rebellion, and humanity as catalyst for galactic awakening. What began as a war of survival soon became something far greater. With the Varn repelled and Earth bloodied but unbowed, the galaxy now looked at humanity not as a threat, but as a question. How could such a young, fractured, chaotic species withstand what others would have surrendered to in moments? Why did they not only endure devastation, but thrive in its wake? And more disturbingly to the Accord, why were other species beginning to admire them? In the months following the Battle of Ceres and the destruction of the Varn offensive fleet, the lines of battle blurred. There were still skirmishes, yes, but now, the real war was cultural. Ideological. The galaxy was no longer only fighting humans, it was fighting something far more dangerous, the idea of humanity. Accord broadcasts labeled them unstable, irrational, incompatible with peace. But these broadcasts were increasingly ignored. Pirated human transmissions began circulating across the Accord's highly regulated comnets. Not just battle footage, but stories of sacrifice, of resistance, of raw and painful truth. Footage of families sheltering under bombardment. Soldiers giving their lives for comrades. Engineers pushing impossible machines into the void because there was no one else who could. They were not polished holovids. They were real. And the stars had not seen real in centuries. Entire subcultures began forming across Accord-controlled worlds. Alien youths mimicking Earth slang, trading Earth music, even holding secret viewings of human films like Gladiator, The Matrix, Interstellar. In quiet corners of placid cities built on sterile logic, aliens wept for fictional heroes and whispered about defiance. One phrase kept resurfacing, muttered first in hiding, then spoken in boldness. Maybe the humans are mad. Maybe we've just forgotten how to feel. On Ultra, a once loyal Accord mining colony, workers staged a sit-down strike after watching the story of a human cargo hauler captain who drove his ship into a Varn blockade to save a convoy of refugees. The strike grew into a full-blown mutiny. The miners weren't asking for human leadership, they were asking for human spirit. A sense of purpose that went beyond quotas and efficiency. Alien scholars and thinkers began writing treatises about emotive equilibrium and the dangers of the Accord's sterile peace. Some compared the Accord to a garden, so tightly pruned it could no longer grow. Others argued that peace without freedom was just another kind of cage. One prominent Accord historian, Vila Carr of the Met Hari, famously said during an illicit broadcast, "We called it madness because we could not model it. But it is not madness. It is a kind of brilliance we have lost, the courage to burn, knowing you might turn to ash and doing it anyway." As the ideological fracture deepened, the first major defection occurred. It was the Solari, a race of crystalline beings known for their cold intellect and mastery of gravity tech. Their central AI commune, after analyzing thousands of hours of human behavior, voted by consensus to join Earth. Not for strategy, not for weapons, but for meaning. The Solari ambassador explained their decision simply. You feel, therefore you live. We desire to live. From there, a floodgate opened. Individual soldiers, scientists, and even diplomats from various Accord species began fleeing to human-held territories. These weren't mercenaries, they were believers. Converts to an idea Earth had never set out to spread, but which had grown like wildfire. That existence without struggle, without choice, wasn't peace. It was stagnation. The Accord grew desperate. Censorship increased. Cultural enforcement squads raided universities and private networks. Propaganda campaigns framed humans as reckless existential threats. But it was too late. Even in the heart of the Accord High Council, there were whispers of change. Some of the most dramatic moments came from captured human soldiers. Rather than breaking under interrogation, they spoke calmly, passionately. Some even converted their captors, just by explaining what it meant to be human. One particularly famous case involved Captain Imani Voss, a scout commander who was taken prisoner after a deep space ambush. Her interrogator, an Accord official named Liraven, spent 10 days trying to understand her motivations. On the 11th day, Voss said quietly, "You want to know why we fight? Because our pain matters. Because our joy matters. Because we matter. Even if we're shattered. Even if we're alone. We scream into the void and sometimes, it screams back. And that means we're real." Liraven defected 3 weeks later, bringing with her critical star map data that would lead to the liberation of 3 human colonies. All across the stars, the movement spread. The Spiritborn, they were called, humans and aliens alike who believed that emotion, courage, and meaning could not be sacrificed in the name of sterile peace. On Earth, the cost remained high. Bombed-out cities were still rebuilding. The skies were still patrolled. Humanity had not forgotten the billions lost. But in their place rose something else. Solidarity across species, forged in spirit. Human children were now raised not just with human stories, but with the tales of alien rebels who had embraced the fire. Statues rose not to generals, but to ideas, resistance, sacrifice, memory. What the galaxy saw as contagion, humanity saw as connection. Not everyone would understand. Not everyone would agree. But the signal had gone out, clear and defiant. Spirit was not madness. It was the birthright of every being who dared to dream. And humanity would carry it to the edge of every star. The war was no longer for territory. It was for the soul of the galaxy. Section 4. The Reckoning and the Rising Flame. Word count \735. Theme: humanity's legacy cemented, not as conquerors, but as the igniters of a galactic awakening. The war did not end with a single battle, nor with a treaty signed beneath the flickering light of a white dwarf. There was no galactic ceremony, no triumphant parade. The war ended the way fires do, not extinguished, but transformed into embers, glowing deep and hot beneath the ashes of the old world. Humanity had never sought to dominate. That had never been their goal. What they had fought for, what they had bled and burned and died for, was the right to be themselves. To choose chaos over obedience. To weep openly, to rage loudly, to matter in a universe that had tried to dull every blade of passion into polite conformity. The Accord, once the unshakable center of galactic civilization, was no longer whole. Its members had fractured, some siding with humanity, others retreating into fearful isolation, and a few clinging desperately to their dying model of perfection through suppression. The High Council could no longer deny the obvious. The Spirit-born movement had spread beyond containment. Half a dozen member worlds had already seceded, choosing cultural independence over enforced peace. The attempt to silence humanity had backfired, magnifying their voice instead of extinguishing it. And so, finally, after 5 long years of ideological war, the Accord sued for peace. They expected vengeance. What they received was mercy. When the final delegation arrived in Earth orbit, it was met not with warships, but with transports full of artists, teachers, philosophers, and children. Humanity could have demanded reparations. They could have demanded seats on the council, territories, tributes. Instead, they asked for just one thing. Let every species speak for itself. Let every voice rise, even if it screams. The final treaty, now etched in both human languages and the Accord's ancient tongue, was called the Flame Accord. Not named for Earth, nor for any one species, but for what had spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. The indomitable will to live fully. In the years that followed, a new coalition formed. Not an empire, not a bureaucracy, but a pact of worlds that agreed on one simple truth, that peace without meaning is a prison, and emotion is not weakness. It is proof of life. This new era was not perfect. Freedom never is. Worlds argued. Cultures clashed. Mistakes were made. But something had fundamentally changed. No one was forced into stillness anymore. Debate returned to the halls of diplomacy. Art flourished. Civilizations once afraid to feel began composing symphonies again. Sculpting. Dancing. Dreaming. And at the heart of it all was humanity. Not as rulers, but as torchbearers. Human ambassadors were sought not because of military might, but because they understood struggle. They had learned to live with both scars and songs. Earth became a place of pilgrimage, not just for history but for hope. On the moon of Ilthi, a monument was built, a vast ring of alloy and crystal, orbiting a reborn world that had once been burned by Varn weapons. It bore an inscription in every known language. They called it madness. We called it spirit. And the stars learned to burn again. The spirit-born humans and aliens alike continued their work. They ventured to isolated worlds, still under Accord suppression. They smuggled in music. They shared stories. They lit fires not with torches, but with truth. Earth itself rebuilt, not into a utopia, but into something better, a world that remembered. Cities were reborn with memorial gardens woven into their structures. Schools taught not just the cost of war, but the value of struggle. The names of the lost were etched into walls, whispered in ceremonies, carried in the hearts of every generation. A new branch of humanity emerged, not genetically, but culturally. The children of spirit, they were called. Young humans raised in the knowledge that they had helped change the stars, not by conquering, but by being too alive to ignore. And their fire was infectious. The Solari, who once only calculated outcomes, began composing harmonic poems that resonated across gravity fields. The Methari, who had built sterile glass cities, now painted their buildings with vibrant murals that depicted legends of resistance. Even the Varn, defeated and shamed, found renewal. The few who remained on the edges of civilization sent emissaries to Earth, asking for forgiveness and guidance. Not for penance, but for understanding. And Earth welcomed them. Because that was humanity's true strength, not rage, not vengeance, but memory. Forged in fire, tempered by pain, and guided by a relentless, stubborn hope. They had once been alone. Now, they were not. They had once been silenced. Now they sang in a chorus 1,000 worlds wide. Their spirit, once called madness, had become a movement that could no longer be caged. In a distant future, on the edge of mapped space, a small human exploration vessel found itself trapped in a gravity well near an uncharted system. With no hope of rescue and limited fuel, the crew recorded one final message. It was not a distress call. It was a reminder. We are human. We burn, even in the dark. If you find this, know that we went out the way we lived, with our hearts ablaze. The message was picked up 2 years later by a Solari ship. They broadcast it into the stars, and the stars remembered. Because they had called it madness, but it was spirit, and it had become the light of the galaxy. Asterisk, asterisk.